Walter Grady, aged 66, had become a familiar shadow in the Brooklyn neighborhood he wandered for over a decade. With a silver beard tangled from neglect and hands darkened by cold and grime, he moved like a man who no longer expected the world to see him. His coat, long past its better years, barely shielded him from the creeping winter wind. Slung over his shoulder was the same battered army-issue backpack he'd carried since the late 80s, its canvas faded to a grayish green, straps barely holding together with knots and safety pins. He never let it out of his sight. Not because it held anything valuable to anyone else, but because it was one of the last things that hadn't abandoned him. People in the neighborhood knew him, but only in the way one knows a lamppost or a crack in the sidewalk. Walter didn't beg, didn't make noise, didn't frighten tourists or startle shopkeepers. He kept his patterns quiet and measured. He rotated where he slept so no business had reason to complain. He picked bottles from trash bins and turned them in for change, sometimes collecting enough for a cup of coffee or a day-old sandwich. He occasionally accepted leftovers from kind restaurant workers who pretended not to notice when he sat near the back door like a polite ghost. What few knew, what most never asked, was that Walter had once been a staff sergeant in the United States Army. He'd enlisted young and served long, enduring the worst years in the dust of Iraq and Afghanistan. He had been honorably discharged in 2004. Not a single day of his service had ended in disgrace. It was life afterward that unraveled him. His wife, Margaret, had been the one thread that held his world intact. When she fell sick, they trusted the system he had served. The VA hospital misdiagnosed her cancer. By the time they corrected their error, it was too late. Walter had been by her side every day, until the night she passed, her fingers wrapped around his like a final act of mercy. After the funeral, something inside him crumbled quietly. He didn't make dramatic gestures. There were no long farewells or letters. He simply sold their modest apartment, donated the proceeds to the children's cancer charity Margaret had always supported, and faded into the city. He rejected his family's offers of help. He felt that to accept comfort would be to betray Margaret's memory. She deserved more than the broken shell he had become. In time, even those who once called to check on him gave up. Walter no longer wanted to be noticed. He believed, in some deep place, that he had failed the one person who mattered. Sometimes, when someone did speak to him, a kind volunteer, a concerned stranger, he would mutter a sentence that seemed to explain everything. Sometimes it's easier to be nobody than to be somebody who failed the person they loved most. It was on a November afternoon that the hunger truly gnawed through his resolve. Temperatures had dropped below freezing the night before, and the air still carried ice in its breath. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. Not scraps, not handouts. Nothing. His limbs trembled not just from the cold, but from weakness, his balance uncertain with each step. A half-mile from his usual route stood Morelli's Corner Market. Walter had passed it hundreds of times, always walking on. But this time, the warmth behind the windows called to him with a force he couldn't ignore. His pride was paper-thin now, and his body knew desperation. Inside the store, the light was warm, yellow, almost kind. A small electric heater buzzed near the entrance, and the smell of bread filled the narrow aisles. Walter moved slowly, each step deliberate, as if trying not to make noise on linoleum. His eyes scanned the shelves until he found it, a plastic-wrapped loaf with a discount sticker marking it as day-old. His fingers curled around it. He held it against his chest for a moment, still unsure. Then, when the man behind the counter turned to assist a customer, Walter slipped the loaf into his coat, pulled the zipper halfway, and turned toward the door. He didn't get 2 steps before he heard the shout. Mr. Morelli, a stout man with a face hardened by years behind the register, had recently installed new security mirrors above the counter. He had seen the motion, the coat, the loaf. Walter didn't run. His shoulders remained straight, though the weight of the world bowed his back. He stood still, the bread still partially visible in his coat. He didn't plead, didn't make excuses. His expression said everything. It was not a look of guilt, it was a look of surrender. A look of someone who had nothing left to fear. The call to the police was made in anger. Mr. Morelli didn't recognize the man's face, and he didn't know the story behind the backpack. To him, it was theft, plain and simple. A repeat offense, perhaps. An annoyance. 2 patrol officers arrived within minutes. The older one stayed by the door. The younger, Officer Jenkins, stepped forward, cautious but professional. He saw the man's thin frame, the dog tags glinting beneath the coat's collar, the weariness in his eyes. He asked if Walter was really a veteran. Walter nodded. He offered his ID, nearly worn to paper from years of rain and folding. Jenkins didn't want to arrest him. But the law was the law, and the store owner was insistent. It wasn't about the bread. It was about the principle, or so Mr. Morelli said. The officer slipped the cold cuffs onto Walter's frail wrists, apologizing under his breath. Walter said nothing as he was led outside. The snow had begun to fall, soft and slow, clinging to his shoulders like the weight of memories. At the precinct, he was processed like any other petty thief. Name, ID, fingerprints. The public defender assigned to him barely had time to ask questions. There were too many cases, and Walters wasn't going to make headlines. The loaf of bread had been confiscated, logged into evidence, and then discarded. His court date was set for the next morning. He would wait in a holding cell until then. No phone call was made. There was no one left to call. That night, Walter sat alone on a steel bench under flickering fluorescent lights, his hands folded like a soldier at rest. He wasn't angry. Hunger had stripped him of pride, but not of peace. He thought of Margaret and hoped, foolishly perhaps, that somewhere she knew he had finally tried to survive, even if it meant breaking a rule. Outside, the city carried on. And inside that cold room, Walter Grady, once a man who had pulled fellow soldiers from burning vehicles, sat quietly, waiting for morning to come. Morning arrived without ceremony. The light that crept into the holding cell was gray and indifferent, filtered through bars and fogged windows. Walter had not slept, though he'd tried. He'd sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn up slightly, resting his arms across them in the posture of someone who knew how to endure discomfort. Sleep, like everything else, had become a distant luxury. When the guards came to escort him, he didn't resist. The hallway outside the cell was cold, echoing with footsteps and keys. Other men passed through the system with practiced annoyance or loud protest, but Walter moved silently, his presence barely registering. He wore the same clothes he had been arrested in, still damp from the previous day's snow. His coat smelled faintly of bread and asphalt. The courtroom was unimpressive, its chairs worn, its wood faded, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Walter sat alone at the defense table, his shoulders hunched slightly forward. There was no one in the gallery for him. No family. No one from his past. A bailiff read off his case number without looking up. The young prosecutor was efficient. He cited the theft of the bread, referenced prior similar incidents, noted Walter's lack of permanent residence. He requested continued detention until trial, citing Walter's flight risk, though everyone in the room knew he had nowhere to flee. Judge Michael Carmichael reviewed the file in front of him without much expression. He was known for his strict rulings, for his quick dismissals and measured tone. His reputation was built on order, and on never letting emotion interfere with consequence. As he read Walter's file, he recited the usual questions: name, age, plea. Walter answered quietly, his voice barely audible. Then something shifted. The judge's eyes paused at the line about Walter's military service. A flicker passed over his face, not recognition, not yet, but something like a memory brushing against the edge of thought. He reread the name, Walter Edward Grady. Former Staff Sergeant. United States Army. He turned a page and read aloud the line about the Bronze Star. And then, abruptly, the judge stopped reading. His fingers tightened around the paper. He looked again at the man before him. He looked harder. Without explanation, Judge Carmichael stood. The courtroom froze in mild confusion. Judges didn't stand during arraignments. Not unless something was wrong. He muttered about a recess and walked briskly to his chambers, leaving behind silence and puzzled glances. Inside his office, the judge opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out an old photo, weathered by time and travel. It showed a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, standing before a green canvas tent under a blistering sun. Sand clung to their uniforms. One of the men, young, tall, standing near the back, was Walter Grady. Carmichael stared at the photo, his eyes tracing the faces. There he was too, 20 years younger, standing beside him. In the image, Walter had one arm around a teammate and the faint shadow of a smile. The judge turned to his computer and entered a password he hadn't used in years. Within minutes, he found the mission report. Fallujah, 2003. An evacuation gone wrong. Chaos. A vehicle hit. Fires. Screams. And in the aftermath, it was Staff Sergeant Walter Grady who had dragged an unconscious medic 2 miles through hostile territory. That medic had been Private First Class Michael Carmichael. The words in the report hadn't meant much on paper at the time. But now, reading them again, the judge saw the deeper truth. He owed his life to the man currently awaiting sentencing for stealing a loaf of bread. He sat for a moment, the old photo still in his hand. Outside, the courthouse clock rang 9. He returned to the courtroom without ceremony, his face unreadable. Walter remained seated, still unaware that anything had changed. His expression was the same, distant, calm, detached. He was ready to accept whatever came next. But the room had shifted. The bailiff sat up straighter. The prosecutor lowered his file. Judge Carmichael cleared his throat and asked for silence. He announced that the charges would not proceed. That the defendant, a decorated veteran, was not a criminal but a man abandoned by a system that had failed him more than once. He spoke not with pity, but with clarity. His voice carried the weight of justice, not the blind kind, but the kind that sees. The court clerk hesitated, then moved to stamp the dismissal. The prosecutor said nothing. The gallery remained silent. Walter looked up, confusion passing across his face for the first time. Not hope, not gratitude, just confusion. For 15 years, the world had moved against him. Now, suddenly, it had shifted. The judge asked the bailiff to retrieve a folder from his chambers. Inside was a copy of the old mission report and the photo. The judge handed it to Walter. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Walter held the image in his trembling hands, tracing the lines of faces he hadn't seen in decades. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes, but they didn't fall. Outside the courtroom, the snow had started again. Light flurries danced in the air, catching in the folds of Walter's coat as he stepped through the doors. He still had no home to return to. No change of clothes. No hot meal waiting. But something intangible had returned. Recognition. Dignity. A name remembered, not forgotten. That night, Walter slept in a cot offered by a shelter whose director had been watching the case from the back of the courtroom. It wasn't much. But the cot was warm, and the staff addressed him by name. And for the first time in years, Walter said his full name back. As if it still belonged to him. Walter spent the next weeks in a quiet limbo, neither fully restored to society nor entirely lost to it. The shelter cot remained his place to rest, though the fluorescent lights never truly let him sleep. He ate what was offered, cleaned up after himself, and kept mostly to his corner. The staff were kind, but busy, and Walter did not ask for more than he was given. Each morning, he folded his blanket with military precision and left before sunrise. He returned at dusk, always with a few bottles collected, a few steps slower than the day before. He still wore the same coat, still carried the same backpack, but now there was a folded photograph tucked safely in the inside pocket, kept near the heart, like a badge. Word of his case spread, but not as a scandal. It was more like a whisper. A veteran wronged. A judge who remembered. A courtroom where silence was finally broken. In one corner of the city, a young journalist from a local station caught wind of the story. She had been covering housing insecurity among veterans, and Walter's name emerged in her research. She found him near the waterfront, where he often sat and watched the ferries come and go. He didn't speak easily, but when she showed him the mission report and the photo, now scanned and included in her notebook, he gave her the only permission she needed. The story aired 3 nights later. It wasn't a headline. It was tucked near the end of the broadcast, after weather and sports. But the segment lingered. The anchor's voice softened as she described how a former staff sergeant, once decorated for bravery, had gone unnoticed for 15 years. They aired the courtroom photo. They showed the grainy image of the judge and the soldier in a desert long ago. They ended the piece with a simple quote, pulled from the court transcript. "This is not justice served. This is justice remembered." The next morning, Walter returned from his bottle route to find a folded note taped to his cot. A man had visited the shelter. Said he was a former Marine. Left a phone number and a name, Daniel Irons. Walter remembered the name dimly. From another unit, another decade. He called. Daniel arrived later that afternoon, his hair white and uniform pressed. Not military anymore, but something close, private security, or maybe politics. Walter didn't ask. The reunion was brief, unsentimental. But Daniel offered something, a room. A clean one. A space of Walter's own. No obligations. No strings. Just respect. Walter declined at first. Then, 2 nights later, the shelter was full. The cold outside had driven many indoors, and he found himself without a bed. That night, sitting on a bench with snow gathering on his shoulders, he reached into his coat and touched the folded photograph. Something in him shifted. He called Daniel the next morning. The apartment was modest, but to Walter it felt foreign in its softness. The sheets were clean. The heat worked. There was a kitchen he didn't yet use, and a door he could lock. He moved slowly, uncertainly, like a man walking through memory. Daniel introduced him to a small veterans group nearby. Walter went, once. Then again. Soon, every Wednesday afternoon, he began helping, setting up chairs, greeting others, listening more than he spoke. They never pressed him to share. He did anyway, once. About Margaret. About the hospital. About the day he stopped trying to be part of the world. A few weeks later, someone from the city council reached out. They were forming a committee to study how veterans fell through the cracks, and how to close them. Walter was asked to attend, just to observe. He listened quietly during the first meetings. His coat still carried the street scent. He said little. But when one representative spoke dismissively of behavioral choices, something stirred in him. He cleared his throat and spoke, not loudly, but with authority. He told them about the hospital. About the cost of trust. About silence that felt safer than shame. After that, they gave him more time to speak. By spring, Walter had moved into a permanent unit funded through the committee's pilot program. He didn't ask for his pension to be reinstated, though it was offered. He accepted it only so he could donate part of it to the cancer charity Margaret had loved. The rest he lived on, modestly. He still wore his old coat. Still carried the backpack. But inside the backpack, next to the photo and the report, was a worn copy of the court transcript, the page where his name was spoken not as a defendant, but as a man remembered. One afternoon, a group of high school students visited the Veterans Center. Walter was asked to speak. He hesitated. Then nodded. He told them about his wife. About the war. About the bread. He told them that being forgotten is harder than being wounded. That sometimes, the world sees you only when you break a rule. That even then, dignity can be restored. When he finished, the students were quiet. Then one raised his hand and asked what kept him going during the worst days. Walter paused, then reached into his coat. He unfolded the photo, creased, fragile, and held it up. He said it wasn't just this. It was that someone had remembered. And that memory, more than medals or speeches, had brought him home. By summer's end, Walter's name had become more than a footnote in a court transcript. It had become a conversation, quiet at first, then broader. Not because of speeches or viral videos, but because of the way people began telling one another the story. At first, it was just among veterans. Then among social workers. Then among policy advisors who rarely agreed on anything. It wasn't about politics. It was about a man who had saved lives, fallen through every crack, and still found the strength to ask for nothing. His photograph, the one from Iraq, was printed in a city report about veteran homelessness. His story was cited in council meetings and quietly referenced in new legislative drafts. No one said he was a hero. They just said he was proof of what had gone wrong, and what might go right again. Walter never asked for the attention. He declined every television request. He avoided the reporters who waited outside the community center. But once, after a particularly long day at a policy roundtable, he paused at the doorway and thanked the youngest intern in the room for refilling the coffee pot. The next morning, that same intern started a petition to rename the shelter where Walter had once stayed. Within a week, it had 30,000 signatures. They called it Margaret's house. Walter never stepped inside again, but he visited the street where it stood. He looked at the new sign, simple block letters on brushed steel, and felt something unclench in his chest. Not closure. Something older than that. Something like peace. By the following winter, Walter had taken a part-time role at the center, not as a speaker, but as a presence. He answered phones, helped new residents fill out paperwork, and once repaired a broken heater using only a butter knife and spare wiring from an old lamp. His backpack stayed by the front desk, tucked neatly beneath the coat rack. He began keeping a ledger, something simple. A notebook where he wrote down names, dates, and small notes about the people who passed through the shelter or the community rooms. Who was looking for housing? Who had a job interview? Who needed boots before the snow set in? He never showed it to anyone, but the staff quickly learned to ask him before making any decisions. He remembered details most forgot. He saw things others didn't think to see. One evening, while sorting coats in the donations room, he came across a small brass coin in a box of discarded wallets. It was military issue, engraved with an emblem he recognized, though dulled by time. He closed his fist around it and held it against his chest. It wasn't his, but it could have been. He carried that coin from then on. In his right coat pocket. Next to his hand when he walked. Months passed. Then, one spring afternoon, an envelope arrived at the center. Thick. Cream-colored. No return address. Inside was a formal letter from the Office of Veterans Affairs. Not the local branch, but the national office. It announced that a new initiative would be launched, the Grady Directive. It was a program to identify veterans who had dropped out of contact with the system. The goal was simple, not just to offer benefits, but to re-establish dignity. The program would begin with 5 cities. Then expand. Walter's name would be attached to each rollout. He read the letter once. Then again. He didn't speak. He folded it carefully, added it to the page of the court transcript, the mission report, and the photo. The coin joined them. That night, as the center closed, Walter stayed behind to finish stacking chairs in the common room. A boy, 16, maybe 17, lingered nearby, his eyes darting from the door to Walter. The boy had just arrived that morning. Quiet. Hands clenched into sleeves. No address. No ID. Walter offered him a glass of water. Then a seat. Then silence. The boy sat. Said nothing. After a long pause, Walter reached into his coat and pulled out the brass coin. He placed it on the table between them. No explanation. No pressure. The boy looked at it for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice barely broke the room's stillness. He said he didn't have anyone left. Walter didn't argue. He simply nodded, slid the coin back toward him, and went to refill the water pitcher. In that moment, something passed between them, not pity, not charity. Just a quiet agreement that kindness, when given without question, had its own kind of authority. A month later, the boy started volunteering at the center. 3 months after that, he got his GED. When someone asked who had helped him the most, he simply said, "The man who gave me a coin but didn't ask for thanks." Walter never stopped walking the city in the mornings. His steps were slower now, his limbs stiffer. But people nodded to him on the street. The deli owner slipped him extra coffee. The post office clerk saved stamps for him. And sometimes, just sometimes, a stranger would stop, shake his hand, and say, "I know who you are." He never answered those words with pride or surprise. He only nodded, gently, and went on his way. Because he had already returned home. Not to an address, but to a world where memory mattered. Where one loaf of bread could bend the course of a system. Where justice did not come with sirens, but with silence. And in that silence, the truth stood clear. Kindness without question is enough.